A busy week indeed for the Judicial Service Commission as it wrapped up 4 rounds of interviews for the position of Chief Justice. Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, Gauteng Judge President Dunstan Mlambo, President of the Supreme Court of Appeal Mandisa Maya and Constitutional Court Justice Mbuyiseli Madlanga are all in the running and have had the opportunity to convince not only the President but the entire country as it is why best they are suited for the position. Judge Dennis Davis joins me now live from Cape Town to reflect and discuss the interview process. Thank you so much for your time, Judge. We do appreciate it. I think day one was very calm, and then day 4 just transpired into havoc, many would say. But let's try and focus firstly on the line of questioning when it comes to the Judicial Service Commission's questions to these candidates. There have been arguments to say that the questions have not been the right questions, especially when it comes to posing questions to candidates on sexual harassment rumors or whether or not the country is ready for a first female Chief Justice. What is your sense, especially around how the JSC conducted itself this time around?
Look, it's perfectly obvious that there's been a huge amount of controversy about the way in which the interviews have been conducted, but let's leave that aside for the moment. People should judge for themselves on the basis of how should the interview be conducted. In other words, what are we looking for? So what we're looking for is a jurisprudential leader. In other words, somebody who can actually, as it were, take a vision of the Constitution and how it affects ordinary people, particularly poor people. How is it going to, as it were, change the lives of ordinary people as it promises to do? What's the vision that candidate has? And therefore, how will they bring intellectual and legal leadership? Secondly, the obvious question is, you're running a huge institution called the judiciary. You're the number one person there. And so the question arises, what vision do you have for the institution administratively? What record of administration have you had? To what extent have you essentially promoted the cause of justice in your tenure? Because obviously all of these are very distinguished candidates. I think we should emphasize each and every one of them is to probe those kinds of questions. And to a large degree, I think it's fair to say that did not happen. It used to happen in the JSC. It hasn't happened this time around to a large extent, and that is problematic. I suppose what is also problematic is one would expect broadly the same line of questioning to every single candidate, because you want to see how they answered these questions, and that also didn't happen.
Certainly. I want us to move over to some of what many would say was sexist questions posed to Supreme Court of Appeal President Judge Mandisa Maya, to say she was constantly asked about her role as a female in the judiciary and whether or not the country would be ready for a female Chief Justice. And she seemed quite irritated time and time again to say, I don't understand why this question is being asked. And I guess that's the question. Why would such a question be asked? Yes, she's the first female candidate that could possibly be the first female Chief Justice, but does it really speak about her capabilities? Should that not have rather been the focus?
Well, it's a good question. Let me try to unpack that as best I can. There is obviously a huge amount of sexism within the legal profession as a whole, and I think that is fairly common cause. I have taught, apart from my judicial career, which ended after about 23 years, I have taught for the better part of 45 years at universities. And I can tell you that over the past 25 to 30 years, on the top 10 students, there have always been 5, 6, maybe even 7 women. And the question is, why is it that the profession, all these years later, still is dominated to a large degree by males? White males in the main, but males, generally speaking, because we've been better on race than we are on gender. So the idea that one would have a woman of caliber, and let's be quite frank, Justice Maya, Justice, the other 3 candidates, has considerable caliber, that we have somebody who's a woman of caliber, and I'm saying not because she's a woman, because she's got caliber and ability, as the Chief Justice is not an unimportant element in relation to symbolism and the fact that perhaps things signal a change. But I agree, if Justice Maya is appointed on the basis essentially that she's a woman, rather than for the capabilities that she has, well, that I think she would probably regard, from what I could gather from the interviews, as somewhat of an insult. And she'd be right to do that, because what they'd therefore be saying is actually not as good as the other three candidates, but we're appointing you notwithstanding. And that can't possibly be the criterion. She stands there as a candidate in her own right. Clearly, because she's a woman, she brings certain attributes, certain perspectives to the role, and those are important, but they must be weighed in the full complex of factors, as I tried to outline to you earlier. And simply using identity as the major criteria, would be, I think, wrong. And I think that was what, from what I could divine from the interview, she was pushing back against.
Certainly. I want us to move over to Judge President in the Gauteng Division, Dunstan Mlambo. Many were expecting there to be some kind of tension and controversial questions posed to Judge President Mlambo. But there was one specific point where he was asked whether or not he favors the Ramaphosa administration and is against perhaps the former President Jacob Zuma's administration because of the kinds of cases that the Gauteng Division has ruled on and taken over. And I want us, before you answer, Judge, I want us to actually listen to some of that interaction and his response to that question about President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Facts are facts in each case, and it has nothing to do with who the parties are. It's a question of applying the law to the facts that are before us. I have no soft spot for President Ramaphosa, as you say. That's the undercurrent of this thing. And I have nothing against President Zuma, former President Zuma, nothing whatsoever as a judge.
So I think that was quite an interesting response, Judge, and perhaps you can just weigh in on how Judge President Mlambo handled himself with some very difficult questions posed to him.
Well, let's start with the simple proposition. Judges are accountable for their judgments, and if a judgment is, as it were, subject to criticism for legitimate grounds, meaning, how could you possibly have come to that conclusion? This is a conclusion which seems to be wrenched away from precedent and from legal reasoning. Does this not therefore allow us to draw an inference that you were prejudiced for a particular party? I'm giving a hypothetical example, obviously. Then that's a legitimate line of questioning. The fact is that in all of the judgments, as I understand them, and as I've read them very carefully, because I not only was I a judge, but I still teach constitutional law, so I read these judgments very carefully. If the argument you've got to ask is, are they wrong? Were they wrong? Were they so palpably wrong that this shows bias? Now, since most of them, which have gone on appeal, the appeals have failed, I don't know what other inference you can draw other than that the Judge President Mlambo gave a correct legal judgment. If you don't like it, well, that's another matter, and you're entitled to say so. But to suggest that if these judgments are upheld and appealed by other judges, by higher courts, that somewhere along the line this shows inherent bias, the answer is no. Perhaps you want to ask yourself, is this not because the arguments that were brought before the court were totally legally flawed? And that's what judges have to do. And knowing just Judge President Mlambo, he calls the cases as the law dictates, and he's right to do so. So I have, not only don't I have a problem with it, I have a problem with the other argument. Because X has lost so many cases, that means you biased against him. Not necessarily. Show us where the law was so wrong that, in fact, the only inference that can be drawn is that you were biased against the litigant concerned. Then we can have a legitimate argument. But that was never, ever shown. And by the way, it can't be shown because, as I've said, most of those judgments have been upheld by other courts, other judges.
I've completely run out of time, Judge, but I have to ask you this question. I think yesterday everybody was also expecting some bombshells to be dropped with regards to Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's interview process. And at the end, I think many did not expect that response. Everybody was wondering why Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo visited the President then in 2008, why he visited him at his house. Many are saying it was unethical. Commissioner Julius Malema saying it was unethical and it's brought the judiciary into disrepute. What do you think about that response as to why he visited then President Jacob Zuma in 2008?
Well, I think he gave an answer. I didn't find anything wrong with the answers that he gave. obviously, I wasn't quite sure what inference was trying to be drawn, whether that he, on the one hand, he was being damned if he didn't, damned if he didn't. In other words, damned on the basis that, well, you're anti-Zuma, and then suddenly you're meeting Zuma. So I wasn't quite sure what was being suggested. If it was being suggested that he cavorts with politicians in an improper way, well, it didn't seem to me that was the case, and there was something quite moving about Justice Zondo's explanation that as a citizen, and knowing Mr. Zuma very well, he was concerned about the prospect of violence in South African society. So, people have to judge for themselves. I certainly personally didn't think that was a particular factor that should weigh at all in the broader considerations of which of these four distinguished jurists should be appointed as Chief Justice. And let me make one final point. Remember this, the Judicial Service Commission can make its recommendations, but they're not binding on the President in any way. They're merely recommendations. And he has taken other advice too. He will probably take advice from others, including his Minister of Justice, including his legal team. And so therefore, what the JSC says is only, as it were, their view, and it's not binding on him in any way. He'll have to make that call.